All right. Well, we can get underway. Welcome, everyone. So usually, we'll kind of do like, if there's anyone new. I think right now we just have one new person, which is Ashley. Hi, Ashley.
I do like a mini intro, or I don't know. I don't know if it's
Sure.
necessary. Hi, I'm Ashley. I've done a lot of stuff in the Rust and Node.js ecosystems. I'm currently working on tooling focused on packaging and release for binary artifacts, which is why I'm here.
Yeah. I think pretty understandable relevance there. Um, awesome. Well, super happy to have you. So, okay, usual standing topics, CFP tracking. Looks like we had this note about the open CFP for KubeCon EU. Are there others? And I ought to go through and sort of put these into the table, fill in more info for them. Are there other conferences that we're tracking? Let's see.
This one just happened, but I know that they're thinking about scheduling for next year and potentially would be good for this group, which is Packaging Con.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if you all discussed that. It happened in late October in Berlin.
I don't think that we had discussed it. No.
Oh, well, I'll put something in the notes.
Awesome. Thank you. Here. Okay, so I need to go through and fill these in more completely. All right, cool. Language and build tool outreach. I think this is another one where we may want to kind of go through, maybe in a future meeting where we have some more of the folks who are listed as contacts here, go through and kind of update the status of them. But is there anything new here? Oh, cool. I see Ava joined as well.
Uh, Again, this might be me just being new and very loud. I'm like loud in meetings. I would be curious for a more fine-grained update, potentially on like the Rust integration or some of the other ones here.
Yeah.
Just
So
hasn't been a status update.
yeah, so I think basically, as far as I figured we would sort of get into it in a bit, but actually, I guess they already have the tab open. So for the Rust stuff, we have not had, at least so far, any direct interaction with the Rust project to talk about building out any sort of integration of OmniBOR stuff into Rust tooling. Part of that is just that we kind of wanted to get this implementation of OmniBOR in Rust to a better state before doing that. There's also, so I think a little bit of backstory here. So we had worked on this, basically the Gitoid Gitoids, Git object IDs are the usual, it's like are the mechanism that are used for like actual artifact identification within OmniBOR. And we basically sort of worked on that implementation. And then when we got into working on more of the sort of proper like OmniBOR manifest implementation stuff, realized, hey, we have questions about the spec that we were working on and sort of the language used and clarity around it. And so there was a kind of detour into a bunch of spec work that I would say at this point has mostly resolved. I think we have kind of a couple of larger issues that are open, but a lot of the stuff that was blocking the Rust implementation, I think, is resolved at this point, but haven't yet sat down to start actually writing the Rust stuff. So that's pretty much where it stands. So cool. We can come back to that. But do we have any POC demos for anyone?
Well, actually, can I raise an issue which I think I raised last meeting or two meetings ago, which is actually putting together an ask for the various different language communities, so that when we have out them, we can actually say, "This is what we're doing. This is what we want, and this is why it would be valuable to the particular community, or valuable at large, or whatever." That way we can go in with a message rather than kind of what we did with Python, which is, hey, let's talk to somebody. Okay, what are we going to say?
Yeah. something that's more sort of purposeful and planned, versus kind of, I think, how we've done it in the past. I mean, that seems like a good idea to me. I think this also ties into the draft use case document, which I've got a partial but not completed draft on. So also a good reminder for me to go and finish that so we can get more feedback on it. So I think for this, putting together an ask for the different language communities, would you imagine this as something that's like, are there materials that we are missing that ought to be created that we can kind of enumerate?
This may be a silly question, but I think one of the useful things is when we talk about the language communities, do we know who we talk to, like within them, like who the audience is specifically? Because I don't know, thinking about Rust, like where would we, like which portion of Rust, who would we talk to ask this? Because like if we go just straight to like core teams or something, it might be slower than knowing like we want to talk to a security team or we want to talk to a compiler team.
Right. No, and that's a good
Very
point. I think,
motivated by different messaging.
yeah. And I think the way that we've handled, I think it's very much been like we have on the Omnibor side a person who sort of takes on like, I'm going to go reach out. Usually that's someone who has some existing connection to the relevant team. So for example, for Rust, Nell Shamrell Harrington was one of the sort of active people involved with Omnibor for quite a while, and had been kind of the person who had us the to-do to get integration happening with Rust, but then we sort of didn't get our Rust stuff together in time, and then Nell had to go on to other things and isn't able to contribute now. So but that is a good point of trying to have specific people rather than just a vague sort of the project. Yeah. Okay. So
maybe what we need is kind of a roadmap, which is what do we at, kind of what are the stages of what we ask for. So the first thing would be like a connection into the blah team. And if that team doesn't exist, kind of the blah prime team. So whether that's the security team or the compiler team or whatever. And then what are we asking and what's the value proposition to that team?
The other thing I might mention, and again, not to make this specific in Rust, but I think this is very true in JavaScript as well. It is a lot of languages have learned that talking to the official team can be a massive like bottleneck. And so what they like to see is showing up with tooling from the ecosystem. And so we may actually find more eager participants from the ecosystem, and where we can gain momentum and popularity there, and then think about it being promoted into the official project themselves. Inevitably, I mean, thinking about Rust, but I know this is also true in JavaScript, like things also move very slowly through projects, and they often need a lot of points of proof. And so if you can show up to those official things with significantly more points of proof, like something that works end to end, it can be a better experience.
Now, if we had a package manager to integrate that end-to-end stuff with, that might be interesting.
Yeah, so for Rust specifically, actually, this makes me think about, I have just started talking with Florian Gilcher about, well, in specifically the context of software bills of material, because I posted the thing about trying to work on Cargo SPDX, and Florian was basically like, hey, Ferris is doing things in this space and we should talk.
I'm laughing because I sent him anyways.
Okay.
I
cool.
told him to talk to you.
Okay, cool, good. So I actually need to poke him again because I don't think I've heard back from my latest thing. But yes, that there could be a connection there to, in addition to software bills of material, I think, to talk about Omnibor as a complementary thing. And this also gets to, I would say, just as a side note, so the project was previously called GitBomb, renamed it to Omnibor. I think part of the concern there was confusion with software bills of material and wanting to clarify sort of the distinction between the purpose and goals of the two of them, in particular that the goal of Omnibor is different. It's more fine-grained, and it's also generally, it's encoding manifests of hashes, not like links to projects. So there's sort of different use cases. Anyway, I think that I should talk to Florian, basically, I think is what I'm saying for this. Let's keep like input that make this part of that conversation with him.
Yeah, I guess the part of the reason I had brought Florian in is I know there's like a small number of Rust companies that are like interested in this particular thing. My suspicion is if we were to approach integrating it as like a Rust plugin, like a cargo plugin, like Cyclone DX is doing this, we will be able to move faster and get people more excited and more interested than if we tried to go via the project, would be my suspicion.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Okay. Cool, excellent. So I think as far as specific actions to do here, because going back to the community list for Rust, I mean, I think it's probably worthwhile to take, like, I put my name in here instead of Nell's, just so that Nell has been sort of actively involved in the project for a bit, and to sort of have as the status that I'm looking to make this part of the conversation with Florian and to try to pursue what we're describing here, rather than directly integrating with the Rust project, pursuing something like what Ashley is describing, having kind of external tooling that can then be in the future can be sort of brought in to the Rust project if it's sort of proven out people like it and are interested.
I certainly think that that's a successful strategy, just because that's generally how the Rust project likes to do things. And the cargo itself has had a lot of stagnant. So, I mean, the compiler has a lot more activity on it, but cargo's been struggling a bit. Can I, as the person who came to, can I also suggest that I'm interested in collaborating here?
Sure.
Okay.
Here, let me...
You just listed Ferris Systems, and I was like, oh, we're also here.
Yeah. Okay, just make sure I also have the spelling correctly. Axo.dev with the dot or dot spelled out?
It's fine, either one works.
Okay, cool. All right. Awesome. Do we feel like there are further things to say on this? Because I think this is a good goal. And then, you know what, actually, because I do prefer when things have concrete to-dos associated with them.
So I was gonna say, I wonder, and this is the thing that isn't clear to me and was what I was chatting with Florian about, is like, what does a POC look like for OmniBOR?
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's my cue to jump in, since this is something I've been wishing for a while, but I would like to see an end-to-end demonstration, starting from GCC, LD, start from your source code files, compile OpenSSL, right? Up to the next tier of language abstractions, something like Python, or something like Go, right? Up to the next tier from there, a packaging system, whether that's Debian RPM or Docker, something like that, up to a runtime environment scanning tool that can look at the OmniBOR tree or graph for that artifact coming into a production or mock production environment and provide a gating function. Think like Open Policy Agent in a Kubernetes cluster might scan the container that has been requested to launch and make a determination that, this contains deeply embedded in it a version of OpenSSL that we know from the OmniBOR graph has a vulnerability, therefore block its launch. That's my vision for a full end-to-end here.
With the current state of the OmniBOR libraries, do we have the first half of that end-to-end yet? Where like you go from source code to an artifact that has an embedded
Yes,
That
we
much?
have, and we have demoed that for OpenSSL, for the Linux kernel, for a number of other packages. With GCC LD LLVM, we have some demos around Rust and Go, but they haven't quite reached the maturity level here, and we don't have it for the Docker, the package tier. The other missing piece in this is some sort of a public repository. And I know David has been very interested in that portion of the requirements. For each of these build steps, where do they upload? How do they share and distribute the artifact input manifest such that they can be more easily linked, scanned, etc., down the process? The assumption that I'm keeping in mind for all this is each step may be run by different people who don't talk to each other, different organizations that don't talk to each other. So the artifact input manifest either needs to be embedded in, shipped with the produced artifact from each stage, or centrally stored and made available.
So on the central storage, as I kind of have waved my hands in the past, I've done some IPFS stuff.
Yeah.
And I had put in a patch to the SIG store or whatever the SIG store signing tool is, to be able to sign an IPFS node and get that into the SIG store public repository. They basically, the team basically said they had no interest in it. But I think that would be part of it. So not only are you uploading the artifact to a public, to a public repository, but also signing it and having that signature in the SIG store blockchain or chain or whatever it is. What are your thoughts, Ava and others, on the importance of that with regard to the demo that you just outlined?
I don't think it's necessary for the demo. I'm not even convinced it's necessary, period.
I just commented something somewhat similar.
Well, yeah, so a central repository for artifact input manifests, there could be many, but there should be at least one place to distribute these. There's a longer conversation there we've had about how do you distribute these. And
Yeah.
So the manifests are embedded in the artifact, and then the idea for the external registry. No. Okay.
No. The manifest is never embedded in the artifact. The manifest ID, the hash of the manifest, can be embedded in the artifact. So that's why it requires a separate distribution. The manifests themselves can become moderately large. They're still about 1/1000th the size of an SBOM, so 10 to the 3 smaller. But that's still non-trivial for a large project like Linux. It doesn't fit in the elf header section, right? But the hash ID of that input manifest is a fixed size and can be embedded in any artifact. At least any artifact we've looked at, and in principle, any artifact. It adds like 50 bytes.
Yeah, and just showing this is Annex B of the spec, which covers embedding that input manifest identifier in an elf in the elf notes section.
Yeah. So that's why a place to look these up is necessary. You have the ID of the input manifest in the artifact. You have to retrieve it from somewhere. And it could be distributed as a file alongside the artifact. That's fine. That's why a central storage is part of the demo, but not a necessary part of the sort of end result. It's not a requirement of every system. That answer your question, Ashley?
It does a bit. I'm curious, is there a reason including it alongside the artifact as the default location for it is not desirable?
No.
Okay.
No. But for demonstration,
I asked only because there might be, but that feels to me that potentially that Centralized registries are hard for a lot of reasons, I
Yes, they are.
guess.
And
the
yet we have a
infrastructure.
few dozen of them, and they all seem to work relatively well, not without challenges. PyPI and Crates.io are central registries for given domains.
Oh yeah, totally. I guess I just mean like things like NPM and Crates.io are just completely falling over under their own success. So like the incentivization of those systems is complicated.
That's a different discussion.
Related to that, and I just put this in here, there are existing things that are in some way working on like dealing with attestation distribution. I know within the IETF there's SCIT, which I think was previously SCIM, came out of Microsoft, but it stands for Supply Chain Integrity, Transparency, and Trust. I don't know where that project stands right now, but that is their whole thing is explicitly about like defining a mechanism for distribution of attestations, and you could view an OmniBOR manifest as just basically being like another form of attestations. There's a degree to which we don't necessarily need to invent an OmniBOR specific thing if there are other things that gain traction for doing distribution of the attestation.
100%. Ed and myself have always viewed this as solve one thing, solve it well, don't try and solve other things. So the distribution problem, the attestation of the manifest, those are problems that other efforts are trying to solve. We can piggyback on that work if or when it's necessary.
Yeah, agreed. So one thing that comes to mind here, because I think if I like I really like the goal of having the end-to-end proof of concept. I think one of the challenges that we've maybe had with sort of making OmniBOR into like a kind of a real thing that is being integrated in places is kind of having the more concrete goal of something that we're driving toward, to both on the technical side to produce specific implementation sort of needs to meet this, and then also sort of community outreach and like a plan for that. I think drafting out a more concrete kind of path to proof of concept, including identifying what are the technical things that we're missing, as you were kind of sketching out a few minutes ago, as well as what community or couple of communities we would want to target for trying to make this happen. That makes it easier to sort of have a sense of direction and pursue it. And I think we've gotten to a point of the spec that I feel like we are more ready to do that than we were previously.
Great.
So I think this is all of a piece, and I like it. I feel good. So I'll put together just a document that can kind of be the organizing place. I think they'll probably end up being, for the technical work at least, it'll probably also involve making like a project on the GitHub org and decomposing it into stuff. But yeah, I can start to do that.
I think technically the missing piece that's going to take the most work is, let's say, Docker integration, right? Docker build. And there are some challenges to solve in that when I've looked at the code for how Docker build calculates the hash of a given layer. Building this in, it's going to take a bit of work. And then I think the storage piece is, as for the demo purposes, it could be as simple as literally an FTP server. Like just for the demo, all I want to show is there's one storage place that 4 different build systems all upload to, and a scanning system pulls from. That's it. Don't care what it is.
Right, because that question is kind of orthogonal to showing the value here. Yeah.
Yep. Same thing for. Go ahead, Ashley.
Could you use like a GitHub releases for that?
Possibly, but
because GitHub releases, you basically can just like bundle. It's like sort of attaching a bunch of kind of arbitrary data to a.
You can use it as a static file server.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see why not. Again, going for minimal complexity. My old brain says just stand up an FTP server.
Yeah, I guess the trick I would say is like thinking potentially from the open source communities I know, like accessibility, like just using GitHub releases is actually much easier than the idea of standing up an FTP server.
Like I said, I'm old.
I think it just is also like more visible so people could see it, whereas like the FTP server now or something, I mean, I guess I don't know what the accessibility would be or like permissions model or anything. Then we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I think doing it on GitHub invites more questions than I would want at the stage of like an early POC demo. But that's, again, I'm an older developer. I'm less familiar with building stuff on GitHub than using GitHub to distribute the artifacts of my build process. So I have to jump to another meeting though, but I think this is a cool direction, and I'd love to help support it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Ava. Cool.
So let me actually toss something out. Rather than using GitHub releases, why not just use Git, where there's a repository that contains all of the trees or many of the trees. And when a particular build is done, there's a patch created for that repository. The patch is uploaded. And that way, you know, that way there's actually an immutable record of what was changed by whom, when. And, you know, that there might be something that then digests that through a GitHub action or through a GitLab action or whatever to turn it into a traversable index.
So when people build package managers in GitHub, this is exactly what they do. You can like look at the old crates.io index. It's doing functionally this. The only thing I would say is like you probably don't want that to go further than a proof of concept because you will have absolutely massive performance issues, and GitHub tends to not like when you do it. But it's a nice option.
Yeah, I mean, I
that's the crates.io like registry functionally for all the metadata.
It's huge, as I recall, and it has been a source of kind of, as you're saying, like GitHub getting frustrated at how big and you know actively accessed it is.
But it's a great way to like get a lot of functionality you would want out of a registry like very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, like it took a while to get to the point of like, hey, we really have to stop using this thing, and the more recent move to the new thing.
Yeah, so it can get you pretty far. So I think from a proof of concept standpoint, I think it's a nice idea. I do think if the audiences that we're targeting, and it, again, I'm so new, so everything I could say right now maybe sounds super dumb, but if the audiences, like the success of this project is about open source tooling adopting this, as much of the demo that can be just like where those people work and using tools that they use, like the more it's gonna feel like they can do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm quite liking the idea of you know, using Git and you know having that be kind of the record of you know manifests that are the product of doing the demo, basically. Like, hey, we you know built this thing. Here's these you know OmniBOR manifests for the final artifact and all the intermediate artifacts, and ooh, look, now you can observe and you know produce your dependency graph of all of the different things that were involved in the build, and yeah, that seems quite nice. So cool.
Also, I didn't get what the downside of using Git would be, and I certainly understand what the downside of using FTP is, which is funky and nobody uses it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like as far as the downside of using Git, I think it's mostly about in the long term, eventually the repo gets big, and depending on sort of how you use it, you know, GitHub may start to complain about, you know, a big repo that is getting hit really heavily for, you know, people using it. But it kind of depends on, is the repo something for a proof of concept where it's really just sort of there as like evidence that people can go play with and you know, and sort of see the value of, you know, having OmniBOR, or is it like the crates.io index where it is, you know, a key piece of kind of infrastructure for, you know, any Rust project.
I see.
So I think, yeah, I think the problem is basically if you do it wrong, eventually GitHub gets mad at you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's really a very much a future problem, and honestly would be a great problem for this group to have, right?
Yeah, I kind of think so. I like the GitHub releases idea a lot more than an FTP, right?
I would say for GitHub releases, the interesting thing, I mean, I really love the idea of using Git because you get all that history and that is super cool. GitHub releases is nice because it's how people release software and open source today for the most part. People use GitHub releases. And so the idea that this produces an artifact that they store alongside their other release artifacts, I think can make sense. And then maybe from there, there's like, I mean, I kind of see it as we might want to do both, where like if you're producing these artifacts, they are released with your other artifacts as you do in a GitHub release, and then you publish those artifacts to a centralized registry.
So there's a very interesting attribute of the artifacts, which is because they're a directed acyclic graph that is expressed as a Merkle tree, the more releases that are done, the fewer nodes that will change in the graph. Because the more releases that are done that kind of depend on particular things, the less the graph is going to change. So there's going to be a particular pattern of very, very rapid changes in the beginning and fewer changes as things go on. I'm also scratching my head wondering whether the Merkle tree-ish nature of the OmniBOR receipts would play well into Git itself. In other words, whether there would be some particular way that, Git is an incredibly fast index, whether there's a way that we could express the Merkle trees in a way that plays well with Git's native indexing system. And the more that we can do that, the less weight it's going to be on something like on any Git service, because all of a sudden, the change sets are fewer and the indices are pretty fast.
Yeah. So, and this is potentially going to sound ice cold, and I definitely do not mean it in this way, but when I think about getting, like, in order for this to be a successful project, we need widespread adoption across build tools. And my strong suspicion, and I could be potentially totally wrong here, but my strong suspicion is that getting those build tools to use this is going to have absolutely nothing to do with the content of the manifest, but more how easy and already built into the process they already use to release software, making those manifests is. And so I do think the contents of the manifests are cool, and I think demonstrating why the contents of the manifests are super useful is incredibly important. But my suspicion to start is how can we make it dead easy and cost basically nothing to publishers for them to generate those?
So let me toss something out. First of all, I will disagree with your characterization of it being ice cold. I think it was like super useful. Education and learning is a win. What if there was the receipts published as part of the normal publication process? In other words, not uploaded anywhere else, just kind of part of a release process, and a single beacon sent to a single place that says, by the way, here's a new release. You might want to come and, slurp it up and pull out the receipts. And in that way, it's totally minimal on the part of the people doing the publication. Maybe it's a single GitHub action that sends that ping.
Yeah.
And then kind of the OmniBOR infrastructure to be determined later is the thing that actually slurps that information in. That also, there are some potential poisoning issues there.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's a couple of questions, because when you talk about like at the moment of release, there's like probably like 5 or 6 moments that you could count as the release, depending on which final artifact you're talking about. So if you're talking about like you built a binary, That's like when you push a tag for a build process in a GitHub action. But I guess I don't know to what extent, and I heard Ava talking about these packaging steps that come later. Like when those packages happen isn't all like one step. It's kind of like 3 or 4 steps. Like, do you want to be, is it when you publish to Crates.io? Is it when you publish to Docker Hub? Is it when you create, like push the artifact to your GitHub release? And so I think that that would be the thing that would be good to like get a sense of like which step do we want it to happen on, to figure out kind of like which artifact are we trying to track.
So I would assert that we're trying to track all of the phases. And we also have to worry about the behind the firewall issue for corporate stuff, because part of Ava's vision for a demo is, okay, I'm going to put this live in my cluster. And typically clusters are not themselves open source. In other words, there's some mix proprietary and open. So there would also have to be kind of mechanisms by which there's maybe an internal replication of the proprietary parts of the tree and some sort of internal to a business service. And maybe that's, an augmentation to JFrog or, some of the other artifact management systems or artifact repository systems where there's another form of artifact. Actually, no, I should fucking shut up now, because this is actually the way that we should do it, which is just treat this as an artifact to be stored in the existing artifact repository services. So anything that anybody who's going to publish to Maven Central, for example, and I'm sorry, I keep going to Java land, is where my brain is, just like Ava's brain is in FTP land and your brain, Ashley, is in Crates.io land. All of those lands have perfect validity.
I'm
Anyway,
probably more in the artifactory land than you might imagine.
okay, so you basically
Like, I think
publish.
Crates.io is probably one of the worst examples for us, because Crates.io is a source distribution package manager.
Okay.
It doesn't distribute artifacts, and I think that's a problem it has. So
So if we look at the artifacts as something that can be published to an artifact repository, then an open source project would enhance its release process to not only publish its binary, which it already does, but also publish the receipts.
so this
And
is releases.
yeah, okay.
That's
And
the
so
artifact repository for open source, I guess, from a GitHub perspective, but GitLab has something similar.
okay. So basically what we do is we just say this is another form of artifact to be uploaded, and we somehow associate the uploaded artifact with the underlying artifact. And in that way, it's like, okay, you're publishing 2 things rather than 1. I'm sure there's actually probably 7 things that are published when there's a release.
Most people publish, yeah, it's a lot of artifacts. Like usually you're including your either a change log or a license. So like including another like static file like that, especially if the build process where it is straightforward, is not expensive.
Okay, so you include that. Then that would imply a separate indexing service, much like Google is building around Salsa, that will slurp these things up. And that indexing service is then the thing that is consulted for the directed acyclic graph. And that service can also do some, by slurping up the GitHub releases, it can then kind of do some basic validation, at least for certain types, to say, okay, there's a claim of an OmniBOR receipt that has this Merkle tree. What are the 7 different tests we're going to do to, spot check that the nodes in the Merkle tree are actually what they purport to be?
I think that makes sense. Letting people publish their artifacts to where they want to publish them, I think is good. And then having the indexing service be the one that has to be clever about it, I think shifts responsibility to the right parties.
Mm-hmm. And you could also, if we assume that the like the mechanism for having the indexing service, there's an open source implementation. People can just go stand up their own if they don't like wanting to use a central one for whatever reason.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you get the opportunity to potentially create like federations where like you pick what you want to index, which I think is nice. And often
Yeah.
what people generally, at least from what I've seen in package management, people don't actually want a general central global thing because that's very hard to trust.
Right.
So, like an opt-in based on like some type of namespacing is usually preferred.
Mhm. Right. And you know,
So-
I can imagine even so just as like kind of an analogy to I don't know, big DNS, which is like the worst thing in the world. But you know, if people sort of say like I just want to use something, I don't really care, like Google runs DNS, like you can just point yourself at them, or if you know, you can sort of run your own stuff, and it, you know, depends on your sort of models of what you care about and, you know, concerns about threats and whatever. Like it, so yeah.
I think models like that actually are like just spot on. I think that those thinking about packaging with that type of model, I think makes a lot more sense than some of the more traditional ways we've thought about it.
So there is a particular attribute that we have that very few other things that we've discussed have, which is the cryptographic certainty of a Merkle tree. And I'm not saying central repository versus non-central, but what I am saying is when you have a tree with very well-defined nodes, it lends itself very, very well to a distributed system. Because you can basically say, look, this I am handling this hash space. Hooray me. And you know, other services may handle the same hash space or overlapping hash spaces, but it allows the problem to be broken down by hash space or by, you know, some modulo of the hash. And it allows for, but you know, basically because it is a Merkle tree, it's really hard to fake it.
Awesome. No, I think this is really good, and I like this model, and I think the idea of kind of right here, let projects continue to publish wherever, however they currently publish. This is a thing which, in general, I think is good, and which has in other areas of the supply chain space kind of what is this, bothered me, of things where, so like I work on a thing at MITRE called HipCheck. There's a similar thing called Scorecard out of the OpenSSF that, you know, basically does like analysis of repositories for best practices. And, you know, for both of these projects, there's a degree to which, you know, they're limited in detecting certain things based on like workflows that projects use. So like if you want to detect that code review is happening, like there are a bunch of different ways that might be kind of signaled, you know, in the metadata associated with the project or in stuff you could get from like different APIs, GitHub, GitLab, whoever. And there can sometimes be a problem of, well, my tool can only detect if you know these specific workflows, so everyone should just use the workflow that I can detect. It's like, no, it's really more on you to adapt to try and detect the long tail of different things that projects could do rather than having the tail wag the dog. So yeah.
I think it's also good just because I think the only thing that we can be sure of is how people want to publish their stuff will probably change over time. And so if we don't insist upon that being unchanging, like we will have a more resilient system over the long run.
Yeah.
Which is positive.
Yeah, it is. And this also gets to the whole like open source software world antibodies against being told to do things, or any sort of feeling of like, you know, being ordered to do stuff, or, you know, thou must like publish things in this way if you want it to work with our system. The response you usually get is, well, you know, forget your system, I'm not going to do that.
Definitely. Definitely. And I mean, I think it also helps solve the problem of, you know, not everything's open source, and we want OmniBOR to work for closed source or limited source available things. And if we just assume it is published next to where the thing is, like wherever it's published, and you index it, like if you have access to the artifact, then you'll have access to the manifest. And so
Yeah.
there's not like additional access we have to implement, which is great because implementing access permissions is terrible.
Yes. Related to this, and this is just like a nice thing about Omnibor relative to SBOMs. So when the executive order on cybersecurity came out, which was like more than a year ago now, one of the first things that it said to do was that there had to be like NIST had to organize a workshop on SBOMs, and it was like a super short time frame, and a bunch of different companies participated, and so many of them were very, I would say, angry and concerned at the idea that they might be forced to disclose things that they viewed as sort of private or proprietary by including them in SBOMs for the software that they're distributing. The nice thing about Omnibor compared to that is that effectively what you're distributing is a bundle of hashes with some structure. And so saying to people like, hey, you need to disclose hashes of stuff that you made, it's kind of like, okay, sure. Like I feel like that is a much easier lift because there's not actually much information in there without kind of the context to add meaning to those hashes.
Yeah, not very meaningful.
So there's one other thing, and I've touched on this a few times, which is zero knowledge proofs. So if you have to distribute something and you don't want to distribute the hash, you can basically distribute a zero knowledge proof that says I've observed this part of the graph, and I can, through the zero knowledge proof, that is a cryptographic attestation that I've observed the graph without actually releasing it. I was on some of those NIST calls where some defense contractors were very, very concerned because, and their concern actually was one where having a hash itself was a potential information leak, because if an adversary had access to the source code, they could actually, with a hash, determine what version was running. And based on knowing what version was running, the adversary could potentially attack the system. And that's for systems that are heavily guarded, where indications of compromise, where you're testing a whole bunch of different things, are surfaced up into a security operations center. So being able to have the one shot of, we know that this is the actual version running and this is a vulnerability in it, was viewed as a potential information leak. Now, once again, I've never done defense contracting. I've never done defense systems. Well, except I did some stuff for FEMA back in the late 70s. But, other than that, I really don't have a lot of exposure to that world. But I can see the kind of concern of any knowledge leaking is bad.
Yeah. In this system, and maybe I'm missing something, but my sense is that if the goal is to keep the manifest next to the artifact, then the manifest is accessible the same way the artifact is. So it's not like publicly publishing that, which would, even though it's a hash, and I think the distance between like what is running, if you're looking at an SBOM versus looking at this, is bigger, which is always nice. But I think we're suggesting we don't publicly publish it.
I think the manifest has to be available, otherwise it has no value.
Well, I think the idea is it's available to the people that are already going to have access to the software anyway. So there's not like a wider distribution necessarily beyond just who's going to have the software.
Right. If you have access to the artifact, you have access to the manifest. But if you don't have access to the artifact, then you don't have access to the manifest. If the access patterns for the artifact are exactly the same as those for the manifest, that should be coherent, I think. So
the argument that I heard, once again, I'm parroting what I heard on some of the NIST calls, relates to secret keeping. So if you know, and this was also with hardware systems rather than pure software artifact systems. So if you know a particular route, I'll use router, but substitute some military system, there might be a way of physically guarding that thing but the description of its contents is much harder to guard because it can be replicated easily. So thinking about software purely as software, you're exactly right. But thinking of embedded systems that also have these descriptors, and the descriptors are either accessible through the system or delivered with the system. The concern is that is information that's harder to control than a physical system.
I think that I am not following.
Okay, so let's say I deliver a router to you and I say, here's a software bill of materials for the router, whether that's an OmniBOR receipt or just, you know, SPDX, whatever. I can control physical access to that router. It is much harder for me to control access to the SBOM that describes the systems that are running inside that router, or the software that's running inside that router. So for physical
Because one
system,
is physical and one is not.
right.
Is there does that map to what we're talking about with OmniBOR though? I guess I thought we were strictly in a software universe with OmniBOR,
So
but
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong in this description, I think the concern, like this sort of defense industry concern, is that if you have, and I'll say, like, I've seen this come up before, I do work with the DoD, if you have a particular system that is very important and, you know, security critical, and is incorporating open source software or any sort of software, you care very much that basically no one knows, not just like the software that you've made, but also like what stuff has gone into it, like what other, you know, third-party components have gone into it. And the concern would be that about basically even a hash, if, you know, basically if you're sort of distributing in some way manifests, or, you know, getting somewhere you don't want them to be, and then someone, you know, an attacker has in hand a piece of software that happens to be also that you're using, and so they can produce the hash and match it against the manifest that you've distributed, that they then know, hey, great, if I go and attack this open source software, it will specifically compromise this system that I've gotten the manifest for. And so, but I don't necessarily think that's a, like, I don't know that that changes the calculus here, because again, like, the idea is that the manifests would be controlled, sort of access control, like distribution control, in the same way that the software itself is. So to like put it into the DoD world, you know, if you have the software for a classified system, like, that software is itself classified, and there are a variety of, you know, access controls around like where that software can end up. And if it ends up anywhere that's not allowed, it's a, you know, a big deal. It's data spill. You have protocols involved with dealing with that, and you would handle both the classification and sort of the handling protocols around the manifests in exactly the same way.
yeah, that was what my suggestion was. Like, so if you had like a physical server room that you had guards, like the manifest would be right there next to the physical server in the room with the guards.
And if you find the manifest for a classified system that has somehow ended up on an unclassed system, you treat it as a data spill that's going to involve your cleanup protocol, the same way that you would do if the software itself ended up there. That said, I mean, then this just gets to the DoD side of, they would need to sort of make clear their protocols, that, and security classification guides are the answer here for them, to basically say, hey, your SCG should really make clear that these manifests should be classified at the same level as the software that they're describing.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, these manifests, in theory, these manifests could basically be considered like a recipe for writing the software. It's obviously obscured in many ways, but yeah, I would personally think we'd want to treat these manifests with the exact same level of security as the artifacts themselves, which is why I like the idea of them being co-located as opposed to trying to manage that access with them not co-located.
so I'm just writing this down.
Your note-taking work is very impressive.
Okay,
Very
I will just,
appreciated.
I'll forget everything if I don't write
Oh,
it down.
yeah.
So I know we're pretty much at time. So just unless there's sort of final words, we can kind of wrap up here.
I don't know if this is useful or not, but a goal that I have coming out of this meeting, potentially to attend the next meeting, is I would love to try to either move OmniBOR RS forward and or integrate it such that while I don't have the runtime checking piece, I'd love to be producing artifacts with these manifests reliably using tooling we're doing.
Awesome. Yeah.
I
So
don't know
for
if we're at that level yet, but that is the experiment that I am personally interested in trying.
yeah, no, that sounds really good. As far as OmniBOR RS, basically where I would say that stands is I have in mind a kind of general sketch for what should happen with the OmniBOR crate, like as far as like feature wise, like what is needed for that, but have not yet sat down to actually implement anything. And also, you know, I'm open for feedback on it. So like, if you're interested, be happy to talk in greater detail, you know, have a separate call or whatever to break that down and then, you know, we can sort of go from there for like actual implementation work, but that's pretty much where it stands. The current implementation pretty much it needs to be thrown away. I actually have an open PR that pretty much removes what's in there right now because it both doesn't match the spec and also doesn't really work because it sort of predates a bunch of stuff.
I know how it goes. That's cool.
yeah.
Yeah, let me know. I'm a very boring Rust writer, so I love to write boring Rust. But if you like boring Rust, I'm happy to throw my efforts at it. And maybe some of my team who like writing less boring Rust.
Awesome. Cool. Okay.
I'm gonna
just wanted
take
to-
some
Oh,
in
go ahead.
JVM. So I'm gonna do work on two things. One is the Maven plugin that I never really finished up. So that we can when Maven runs and does compilation, we'll generate Gitoids of the source files and the resulting class files. And the second thing I'll work on is kind of bare bones of a repository service. And if nobody objects, I'll do that in Rust.
Awesome.
Because it seems that we have some crustaceans on the call and, you know, why not?
Cool. Awesome. If you have Rust questions,
hey,
happy to help.
I should follow up. There was someone just made like a really cool like intro to Rust for Java. I'm curious if it's any good. And so I feel like you'd be a good person to check that out.
Feel free to toss it my way, and I'll take a look at it. And Ashley, I sent you a link to some of my thoughts on the broader OmniBOR, like how things can be done, you know, kind of at a broader scale with, you know, federated repository or, you know, kind of index service. So feel free to like take a look at what I do and barf all over it. And I mean that in a positive way because look, feedback is critical.
Feedback's always a gift.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ashley, for joining us. This was your first meeting. So yeah, I think this was really productive.
Cool. Thanks for entertaining me. And
yeah,
I will get more productive and on topic, I'm sure, as things go on.
no, this was great. Thank you very much. All right. I think that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.